Before I landed my job as a nurse in a real hospital, I worked at several different gigs and facilities around my hometown where I attended college, but I had to resume padded with stints at retirement centers, senior living communities, and rehabilitation facilities. I'd worked around a lot of elderly folks. The job felt like just another rung on the ladder for anyone wanting to get into healthcare, but what I didn't expect was the best facilities would leave an impression so dark. It still sends chills down my spine today. That place was Oakwood Retirement Facility where I worked my first night shift. And I still remember the nervous energy that swirled in my stomach that night, the uncertainty and the prickling fear of the unknown. Night shifts were notorious. They mess with your head, your body, and sometimes your life. People shared stories, creepy ones, about what happened during those late hours. I knew I'd probably hear strange noises, experience moments of unease, and maybe even see something inexplicable, but I wasn't prepared for what was waiting for me at Oakwood. Lisa, my supervisor, greeted me with a smile as I clocked in. "Welcome to the night shift. Go get used to it." I promise. Her warmth was comforting. She reminded me of my mom, someone who could ease your fears with just a smile or a joke. She showed me around, introduced me to the other nurses, and everything felt normal. A tight-knit team, nothing to worry about. I felt like I was in good hands. As we made our way to the break room, I couldn't help myself. "Lisa, any stories about this place being haunted?" I asked, trying to play it off like a joke. She laughed. "Why? You want it to be?" I shook my head quickly, laughing nervously. "No ghost here. No Indian burial grounds or poltergeists lurking around. Trust me, we all talk. If anything weird happened, I'd know." Her reassurances should have comforted me, but they didn't. Not entirely. You see, I'd always believed in spirits and things eerie, and I was raised with faith, with a belief in the afterlife. It wasn't out of the question for me to feel like a place could be haunted, and that night something was stirring something beyond the living. My first few weeks on the night shift were uneventful, aside from adjusting to the grueling hours. My body protested, my mind grew foggy from lack of sleep, but eventually I found a rhythm. The nights were quiet, peaceful even. I felt accomplished for surviving them, for growing closer to the residents and settling into a routine. When I got to know each of the residents by name, their medications, their quirks. One of them is Mrs. Jobar, a sweet, frail woman who always had a kind word, gentle smile. So that's why when I first saw her wandering the halls late at night, I didn't think much of it. I assumed she was heading to the bathroom or maybe getting a glass of water. She moved slowly, shuffling in her slippers, her eyes distant but open. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Sleepwalking wasn't unheard of among the residents, but as the nights went on, I started seeing her more often, always at odd hours, always gliding silently from one room to another. The unease began to creep in. There was something different about her movements. When she didn't just shuffle anymore, she seemed to glide like she was floating. Her eyes weren't just distant, they were glassy, vacant. I told myself it was harmless. She was old, probably losing touch with reality, but it wasn't long before her nighttime wanderings became more frequent and more disturbing. One particularly quiet night, I saw her leave her room again, but this time something felt different. She moved with more urgency, darting from room to room, her tiny feet barely making a sound on the linoleum floor. I watched her, frozen in place, as she vanished in the darkness at the end of the hallway, and my heart raced. What was she doing? I shook it off, telling myself it was all in my head, but something inside me knew that wasn't true. The next night, I decided to keep a closer eye on her. Around 3 a.m., I spotted her leaving her room again. This time I followed her quietly, making sure she didn't notice me. She slipped into another resident's room, her movements eerily fast. I waited a few moments, then peeked inside. The room was empty, no Mrs. Jobar, no sign that anyone had been there. I felt my stomach drop. I had just seen her go in. How could she be gone? I reported it to my coworker Rachel, and she gave me a nervous smile. "Yeah, I've seen her do that too," she whispered. "It's been happening for a while now." "Where does she go?" I asked, my voice shaking. Rachel shrugged. "We don't know. One minute she's there, the next she's not." From that point on, the entire atmosphere of the night shift changed. Mrs. Jobar's wanderings became more erratic, more disconcerting. And it wasn't just me seeing her now. Other nurses and aides began to report sightings. Some saw her standing in the middle of the hallway, staring at them with those dead, glassy eyes. Others heard her whispering in the darkness, words they couldn't quite make out but felt deep in their bones. The residents began to complain too. "She stands over my bed at night," one woman told me, her voice trembling. "I can feel her watching me, but when I open my eyes, she's gone." Lisa, our supervisor, was skeptical at first, but even she couldn't deny the growing sense of dread that filled the facility. "Just keep an eye on her," she said. "If she gets up, put her back to bed." But how could we put her back to bed if we couldn't find her? One night I was making my rounds when I saw her again. This time she didn't just wander. She stood at the end of the hallway, her eyes fixed on me, unblinking. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. My blood ran cold. I tried to speak, to call out to her, but my voice caught in my throat. She tilted her head, her neck cracking at an unnatural angle, and then she smiled a wide, toothy grin that sent a shiver down my spine. I blinked, and she was gone. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I wandered the halls, searching for her, my heart pounding in my chest. I found her in the recreation room, sitting in a chair, staring at the window. Her head twitched, her fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat on the armrest. "Mrs. Jobar," I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, my feet heavy with fear. "Are you okay?" Her head snapped around, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that stole the breath from my lungs. "Margaret isn't here anymore," she said in a low, guttural voice that wasn't her own. I froze, my body paralyzed by fear. Her mouth moved again, but the words that came out were indecipherable, ancient, guttural sounds that chilled me to the core. She twitched violently, her body convulsing, as if something inside her was fighting to get out. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I told Rachel what had happened, but when we went back to the recreation room, Mrs. Jobar was gone. We searched the entire facility, but she had vanished. When we finally found her, she was back in her bed, sound asleep, her face peaceful and calm, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something dark and terrifying, and it wasn't over. From that night on, Oakwood was never the same. Mrs. Jobar continued her nightly wanderings, but now there was something more sinister about them. The whispers in the halls grew louder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. The residents grew more agitated, more fearful, and so did we. We tried to tell ourselves it was just our imaginations, that there was a rational explanation for everything, but deep down, we knew the truth. Something had come to Oakwood, something that wasn't human, something that wasn't alive. And it was waiting. The following night was the tipping point, though none of us could have prepared for what came next. We'd spent the day trying to brush off the unsettling events, but it was clear that all three of us were now on edge. Lisa's words kept repeating in my head, "No more complaints." Yet, I knew something darker was at play, something that went far beyond mere whispers or hallucinations. At around midnight, I was sitting in the break room with Sarah and Rachel. We were all unusually quiet, the hum of the vending machine and the low murmur of the TV filling the silence. None of us spoke about Mrs. Jobar, but we were all thinking the same thing. What was she doing during those nightly wanderings? What had taken over her frail body to make her move in ways no elderly person should be able to? Then, the alarm system beeped. It was the door to the emergency exit, the one that should have been locked tight. Sarah shot up, panic clear on her face. "No one's supposed to be going outside," she whispered, her voice shaking. We bolted down the hallway, our feet pounding the tiles. I felt my heart race, dread coiling tighter with each step. We reached the door, and sure enough, it was slightly ajar, letting in a cold gust of wind that chilled me to my core. I glanced at the security camera feed, but it showed nothing. Whatever had opened that door was either too fast to be caught or too invisible to be seen. "Where's she?" Rachel hissed, eyes darting to the darkened garden outside. The three of us stepped cautiously out into the night, the cold air biting at our skin. The garden was empty, just rows of dimly lit pathways and overgrown shrubs. But then, far in the distance, I saw her, Mrs. Jobar, standing motionless by the fountain. Her back was turned to us, but her posture was unnaturally rigid, and her nightgown fluttered softly in the breeze. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to go any closer, but we had no choice. We approached her slowly, the only sound the crunch of gravel under our feet. As we drew near, I could hear it, the whispering. A low, garbled muttering that made my skin crawl. It wasn't coming from her, though. It seemed to be coming from all around us, as if the very air was alive with voices we couldn't see. "Mrs. Jobar," I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge us in any way. "Margaret," Sarah tried. Still nothing. We were only a few feet away now, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. She wasn't just standing there, she was swaying, ever so slightly, as if in a trance. Her head started to turn, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but I was frozen in place, rooted to the ground by fear. When she finally turned to face us, her eyes were blank, completely white, with no pupils, no irises, just milky, hollow orbs staring right through us. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic. It was coming from her now, but it wasn't her voice, it was deeper, raspier, like several voices all speaking at once. "Margaret isn't here," she rasped again, her voice echoing unnaturally, "but she's waiting. Waiting for you." Rachel gasped, taking a step back, but Sarah, brave or foolish, stepped forward. "Who's waiting?" she demanded, her voice strong despite the terror I could see in her eyes. Mrs. Jobar, or whatever had taken over her, tilted her head, that eerie smile never leaving her face. "She knows what you fear. She sees everything. Soon she will come for you too." I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed Sarah's arm and yanked her back. "We need to go, now." But as we turned to leave, the garden lights flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the ground. The whispering grew louder, deafening now, and I realized with horror that the shadows weren't just tricks of the light, they were moving, crawling toward us like living things. Dark, inky figures slithering across the gravel, reaching out with tendrils of darkness. I screamed, pulling Sarah with me as we ran back toward the building. Rachel was right behind us, her breath coming in terrified gasps. We burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us, but the whispers didn't stop. They were inside now, echoing through the halls, growing louder, more insistent. We raced to the nurse's station, frantically flipping through security footage, but it was all static. Every camera in the building had gone dark. The only thing we could hear was that awful, guttural whispering, filling the air, seeping into our minds. Sarah grabbed the phone, trying to call for help, but the line was dead. We were trapped. And then, in the silence, we heard its soft footsteps, shuffling down the hall. I glanced at the clock. It was 3 a.m. Mrs. Jobar was coming, but this time I knew it wasn't really her. The lights flickered again, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to pulse, growing longer, darker. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then I saw her, just a glimpse, at the edge of the light. Her figure was twisted, bent in a way no human body should be, her head lolling to one side as she moved with unnatural speed. "She's here," Sarah whispered, her face pale with fear. I knew we couldn't stay. "We have to go. We need to leave this place. Now." But as we made our way to the exit, the whispers grew deafening, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. And then the power went out, plunging us into complete darkness. I don't know what happened next. I remember running, the feel of something cold and slimy brushing against my skin, the sound of Sarah screaming and Rachel sobbing. But everything else is a blur. When I finally stumbled out into the parking lot, gasping for air, the sun was just beginning to rise. I don't know how I made it out or what happened to Sarah and Rachel. All I know is that I'll never set foot in that building again. And I still hear the whispers. Every night, just as I'm about to fall asleep, they start. Soft at first, barely audible, but they always grow louder. Always. And I know deep down that whatever was an Oakwood retirement facility, it's not finished with me yet. I've lived in Colorado for as long as I can remember, and about 15 years ago, I made a move to a small, quiet town called Grand Junction. Some of you may know the name, but for most, it's probably just another dot on the map, a town forgotten by time. Grand Junction isn't a place that makes the news often. It's a sleepy, blue-collar community that services the southwestern corner of the state. It's the kind of town where the thrum of trains rolling by is the loudest noise you hear. The place moves at its own pace, almost as if the world slows down when you step foot there. That's what drew me in, what made me fall in love with this little corner of Colorado. When I first moved to Grand Junction, I found myself a job at a mom and pop shop in the heart of downtown. The shop wasn't much, but it was mine, and in a town like Grand Junction, everybody knew everybody. It was the kind of town where people didn't lock their doors at night and where folks waved at strangers as they drove by. Life here had a routine, a rhythm that was easy to fall into. You worked, you lived, and you became part of the tapestry that made this town so unique. Among all the familiar faces in Grand Junction, there was one that stood out, a man named Warren Barnes. They called him the Reading Man, and for as long as I can remember, Warren was a fixture in our community. He wasn't just another homeless man you'd ignore on the street. No, Warren was different. He was the kind of man you wanted to talk to. The kind of man who made you feel like you were the most important person in the world during a conversation. Warren had been living in Grand Junction for as long as anyone could remember. His exact origins were a bit of a mystery, but no one really cared. He was as much a part of this town as the mountains that surrounded us. Everyone knew his name, his schedule, and even the alley where he spent most of his days. He was the kind of guy who commanded respect without even trying, a rare thing for a homeless man. I quickly understood why after just a few conversations with him. He was kind, genuinely kind. Talking to Warren was like talking to your favorite grandparent, the one who always had time for you, no matter how busy life got. He always had a smile, always had a kind word, and always seemed to be in a good mood, despite his circumstances. Warren had a routine, one that never changed. He'd start his day at the local coffee shop where the barista would always slip him an extra muffin or cup of coffee. Then he'd head to the library where he'd lose himself in the rows of books that he loved so much. His favorites were westerns, but he wasn't picky. He devoured everything: history, philosophy, thrillers, you name it. The man was a walking encyclopedia, and his knowledge could take you down a rabbit hole that lasted for hours. After his library visits, he'd settle into his favorite spot behind the bridal shop, surrounded by his precious paperbacks. That alley was his sanctuary, his own little world where nothing could touch him. People in town loved Warren. The shopkeepers, myself included, would often hire him for odd jobs, moving boxes, unloading trucks, running errands. He never asked for much, never expected anything in return, and he always did his work with a smile. Despite his homelessness, Warren was a man of immense dignity. He was a veteran, and his travels had seasoned him, given him a perspective on life that few could match. The town had adopted him, really. He wasn't just another drifter. He was our Warren, and we took care of him as best we could. Mary, the baker, would save him fresh bread and pastries. Jake, who ran the hardware store, always had a job lined up for him whenever Warren needed a little extra cash. And Rachel, the librarian, always set aside new books for him as soon as they came in. We all looked out for Warren, and in return, he became part of the fabric of our town. But one Sunday, back in 2021, Warren didn't show up. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe he was sick, or maybe he'd found another place to hang out for the day. But as the hours dragged on, the unease started to settle in. By midday, people on the street were whispering, wondering where Warren could be. It wasn't like him to disappear without a word. By the afternoon, some of the folks who knew Warren better than I did decided to call the police. Of course, it's hard to file a missing person report for someone without an address, and the police didn't seem too concerned at first. But then the owner of the bridal shop mentioned something strange. Someone had found Warren's wallet by the boat ramp, miles away from where he usually spent his time. That's when the pit in my stomach began to grow. Warren was a creature of habit, and finding his wallet that far away didn't sit right with anyone. The owner of the bridal shop went down to meet the investigators at the river, hoping to shed some light on the situation, but by then it was too late. We didn't know how bad things really were until pieces of Warren started showing up along the riverbank. Arms, legs, chunks of his torso. They were just floating there, washing up under the bridge that led out of town where the river twisted and turned like a serpent. The same place they found his wallet was where his body began to reappear, bit by bit, like some kind of grotesque puzzle. The town was in shock. You have to understand, Warren wasn't just a nameless face in the crowd. He was our Warren. The man I had greeted every morning for a decade, the man who would sweep the steps in front of my shop without being asked. The man who brought me flowers he found growing in the alley, just because he thought it would brighten my day. And now someone had taken him and cut him into pieces. It was horrifying, incomprehensible. Someone had targeted him. I knew it. I could feel it deep in my bones. How else could this have happened to such a kind, gentle soul? As the investigation unfolded, the truth of Warren's last moments became clearer and more terrifying. The killer had stalked him, waited for the perfect moment when Warren was alone in the dead of night. The attack had been savage, methodical. The police never released all the details, but the rumors were enough to chill you to the core. He had been gutted, dismembered, left to bleed out on the cold pavement, with no one around to hear his final cries. The thought of Warren, my friend, dying alone like that, it haunts me to this day. I sometimes lie awake at night wondering what his last thoughts, wondering if he knew who had done this to him. Did he see the face of his killer? Did he try to fight back? I'll never know, and that uncertainty gnaws at me like a festering wound. But there was one small consolation. They caught the bastard who did it. And while no punishment will ever be enough, knowing that Warren's killer is behind bars brings me some measure of peace. If justice hadn't been served, I don't think I would have ever been able to sleep again. Warren's death left a hole in our town, one that will never fully heal. He wasn't just a homeless man, he was our reading man. The man who brought light and joy to our lives in the simplest of ways. And even though he's gone, we still feel his presence lingering in the corners of the town he called home. Now, every time I pass the alley where Warren used to sit, I pause for a moment. I remember his smile, his laugh, the way he made you feel like the most important person in the world during conversation. Warren didn't deserve to die the way he did. No one does. But in the end, we can only honor his memory by keeping his spirit alive in our hearts. So here's to Warren Barnes, the reading man of Grand Junction. You may be gone, Jane and Jeff. Never be forgotten. Rest easy, old friend. We miss you more than words can say. Prepared for what would come next. Looking back, I wonder if I should have intervened earlier, but hindsight is always clearer when the shadows have already fallen. It was a cold December evening, a few days before Christmas, when things started to unravel in ways that no one could have predicted. The air was crisp, biting as I wrapped myself in a thick coat and stepped out onto my front porch. It could hear the faint murmur of wind pushing against the bare branches of trees lining our street, their skeletal limbs swaying with a quiet menace. I remember noticing how unusually still everything felt. It was the kind of quiet that presses against your chest, that fills you with the sense of something being deeply, terribly wrong. That night I saw Brian again, standing in his yard just like before, staring off into the distance, motionless. But this time there was something different about him, something darker. His posture was rigid, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the street lights, and his eyes, they looked hollow, almost lifeless. I tried to shake the unsettling feeling creeping over me, telling myself that it was just the cold and the eerie silence of the night playing tricks on my mind. But as I turned to go back inside, I heard a sound that would haunt me for months to come, a faint, muffled scream, carried by the wind from somewhere nearby. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The scream came again, this time louder, sharper, as if someone was in distress. My heart raced as I scanned the street, my eyes darting from one house to another, trying to pinpoint the source. Then I saw movement in Brian's yard. It wasn't him this time, but something else, someone else. A figure barely visible in the shadows was moving toward Brian's house, dragging something behind them. For a moment I thought that my eyes were deceiving me, that it was just a trick of the dim light and my own imagination running wild. But the shape was too real. The figure was tall, hunched over, and pulling what looked like a large, heavy bag behind them. For I could hear the soft scraping of the bag against the ground, a sickening sound that sent chills down my spine. And then the smell hit me, a foul, pungent odor that seemed to seep into the air, thick and rotten like decaying flesh. My instincts screamed at me to call the police, to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed with fear, my body rooted to the spot as I watched the figure disappear into the side yard of Brian's house, the heavy bag dragging behind them. The next morning, the town was buzzing with rumors. A young woman had gone missing, a local waitress who worked at the diner a few blocks away. Her car had been found abandoned on the outskirts of town, but there was no sign of her. The police were combing the area, questioning neighbors, but no one had seen anything suspicious, except me. I knew I should have spoken up, should have told them what I had seen the night before, but something held me back. It was as if an invisible hand had clamped down on my throat, preventing me from saying the words. Fear, perhaps. Or maybe it was something more in gnawing sense that if I spoke up, I would be opening a door that could never be closed again. For days, the search continued. The town was on edge, people locking their doors at night, whispering about the missing girl, wondering if she had simply run away or if something far more sinister had happened. And all the while I kept seeing Brian. He was everywhere on his porch, in his yard, walking to and from the corner store. Always the same blank expression, always the same distant stare. It was as if he was a ghost drifting through the motions of his life, detached from the world around him. And then, one night, the truth finally came to light in the most horrifying way imaginable. It was late past midnight when I was jolted awake by the sound of sirens. I stumbled out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest as the wailing grew louder, closer. I rushed to the window, peering through the blinds, and my blood ran cold. Police cars were swarming Brian's house, their lights flashing, casting eerie shadows across the street. Officers were rushing in and out of the house, their faces grim, their movements urgent. I knew deep down that something terrible had happened, but nothing could have prepared me for the truth. The next morning, the news broke. The missing girl had been found, what was left of her. Anyway, her body had been discovered in the crawl space beneath Brian's house, dismembered, just like Warren. The details were too gruesome to comprehend. Her limbs had been severed, her torso mutilated, her face unrecognizable. The police had found her after a neighbor reported hearing strange noises coming from Brian's basement in the middle of the night. When they arrived, they found him sitting in the dark, his hands covered in blood, staring blankly at the wall. Brian was arrested, of course. They took him away in handcuffs, his eyes still vacant, his expression as empty as ever. But the damage was done. The town was shattered, its sense of safety ripped apart by the horrifying discovery. People couldn't believe it, couldn't reconcile the quiet, introverted young man with the monster they now knew him to be. But I could. I had seen it in him all along, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And now, as I sit here writing this, I can't help but wonder how many more out there, how many more seemingly ordinary people are hiding dark, twisted secrets behind their vacant stares and polite smiles. How many more like Brian are lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. The thought chills me to the bone, because the truth is, you never really know who your neighbors are, not until it's too late. When I heard Brian confess, I couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. I mean, sure, the kid had always been strange, but it was like hearing something out of a nightmare. A human head and hands, he said so casually, as if it was just another day at school or a routine errand. His tone didn't even waver as he described killing a man like he was reading out a grocery list. I stood there frozen, trying to process what he was saying. My heart pounded in my chest as every hair on my neck stood on end. It was hard to reconcile this version of Brian, the cold, calculated murderer, with the kid I used to see riding his bike around the neighborhood, hanging out with his parents in their front yard. But the more he spoke, the more it hit me. This wasn't just some rebellious teenager going through a phase. This was evil, plain and simple. He talked about how he'd spotted the homeless man Warren Barnes sleeping under that bridge, vulnerable and unaware of the horror that was about to befall him. Brian described it in grisly detail, recounting each stab wound as though it was just another tick mark on some macabre checklist, over and over, but Brian wasn't fazed. In fact, he said it was almost amusing to him, the power he had, the control. I'll never forget the way he grinned when he said, "I always wondered what it would feel like. That's the moment I realized we weren't just dealing with a kid who made a mistake. We were dealing with a monster, someone who had been thinking about violence for a long time, maybe his whole life." As Brian continued his confession, the full scope of what he'd done began to unfold. He hadn't just killed Barnes in cold blood, he'd taken his time afterward, methodically dismembering the body like he was working on some grotesque science project. The knife, the gloves, the preparation, it was clear he'd been planning this for months. His obsession with death, with the idea of killing, had finally manifested itself in the most horrifying way imaginable. And the way he disposed of the body? Sloppy, careless, like he didn't even care about getting caught. He drove down to the boat ramp in the middle of the night, thinking he could just dump the pieces and be done with it. But he didn't even bother to make sure everything went according to plan. The blood in the trunk, the wallet left behind it, was all a series of mistakes that led to his downfall. The arrogance, thinking he could outsmart everyone, thinking that no one would notice a missing man or a car stuck in the river. It wasn't long before his mother, Terry, discovered the truth. I can only imagine the horror she must have felt when she opened that container and found Barnes' head staring back at her through a layer of maggots. How does a parent even begin to process that? Her son, her sweet, intelligent, albeit troubled boy, was a killer. Terry wasted no time, though. She did what she had to do, calling the police and turning Brian in. I respect her for that. Too many families try to cover up the sins of their loved ones, hoping to sweep it all under the rug. But not Terry. She knew what needed to be done, and she didn't hesitate, even though it meant losing her son forever. In the days that followed, the whole town was in shock. Everyone knew Brian Coe. Junior people remembered him as the quiet, intelligent boy with a weird sense of humor, but no one, not even his teachers or his parents, had any idea of the dark thoughts that had been brewing inside him all this time. Kids at school who had once laughed off his bizarre comments about dismemberment or murder were now terrified, realizing those weren't just jokes. He had meant every word. The case shook us all to the core. Small towns like ours aren't supposed to have these kinds of horrors. We were used to hearing about accidents, maybe the occasional crime of passion, but this was something else. This was pure evil, lurking right under our noses, and none of us had seen it coming. I still think about that day. About the strange noises I'd heard from their house, about how I'd dismissed so many signs because I didn't want to believe that anything truly bad could happen here. I think about Warren Barnes, the man who had been living on the margins of society, forgotten by most, only to meet such a cruel and senseless end. I wonder if things could have been different if someone had stepped in sooner, if anyone had taken Brian's odd behavior more seriously. Now, every time I drive past that house, I feel a chill run down my spine. The Coe family moved out shortly after Brian was arrested, and the place has been vacant ever since. It's like a ghost town, and no one in the neighborhood talks about it anymore. But we all remember. The memory of what happened there lingers in the air, a reminder that even in the most quiet and peaceful of places, darkness can take root. And as for Brian, last I heard, he's sitting in a prison cell, awaiting trial. They say he's been completely unresponsive, showing no remorse, no regret. Just that same vacant expression he had when he confessed to the murder. I don't think he'll ever understand the gravity of what he's done. Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe that's what makes him so dangerous. In the end, this story isn't just about Brian Coe, Jr., or the terrible crime he committed. It's a warning to all of us. A reminder that we never really know what's going on inside someone's mind. We never know who might be hiding a monster within, waiting for the right moment to strike. And that's the most terrifying thought of all. Alright, I don't know if I should be posting this. I've tried telling people before, but they just laugh it off, saying I've got an overactive imagination or I'm trying to scare them. But I swear this is real, and if you've ever worked the graveyard shift alone, you'll know exactly why I'm freaked out. I've been doing night shifts for years without a problem. You know, the usual quiet hours, a bit of boredom, sometimes weird customers, but nothing truly out of the ordinary until this happened. It was about 6 months ago, and I'd been working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift at a gas station off a back road. It's one of those places that barely gets any foot traffic, mostly truckers or the occasional lost traveler. The area is surrounded by dense woods. During the day, it's almost peaceful. During the night, though, those woods seem to swallow any light or sound. You'd think after a while you'd get used to the silence, but no matter how long I worked there, I never did. This particular night started out like any other. My coworker Steve clocked out at 10:50, leaving me alone until the morning shift came in. The weather was bad, raining so hard you could barely see a foot past the windows, and the wind was howling like it was alive. I was scrolling through my phone behind the counter when the light started flickering, annoying, but nothing new in that old place. Then came the first weird thing. Around 2 a.m. I heard footsteps. Now the station is small, and there's a bell on the door that rings whenever someone comes in, but this wasn't coming from the entrance, it was from the back, near the supply room. I figured it was just the sound of the building settling, but it was distinct. Not creaks or groans, actual, slow footsteps, like someone walking barefoot on the tile. I called out, "Steve?" "You forget something," but there was no answer. I walked over to the back room, thinking maybe he left the door unlocked and some drunk had wandered in. I opened the door. The room was empty. Completely empty. I should have felt relieved, but instead I got this tight feeling in my chest. The kind that makes your skin crawl, like you're not alone even when you can't see anyone. I went back to the counter, trying to shake it off, when it happened again, those damn footsteps. This time they were coming from inside the store, moving from aisle to aisle. I didn't even bother calling out. I grabbed the heavy flashlight we kept under the counter and started walking towards the sound. As I got closer to the aisles, the footsteps stopped. I stood there, gripping the flashlight, my heart pounding. I turned the corner into the snack aisle, shining the beam down the rows of chips and soda. And that's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, the rain making shadows move weirdly, but no. There was someone or something standing at the far end of the aisle, just standing. Their back was to me, completely still. They were wearing what looked like an old torn hospital gown, and their skin, it was so pale, almost grayish white. Their hair hung in clumps down their back, wet and matted. I couldn't see their face, but something about them made my stomach twist. I didn't say anything, just stood there frozen. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Then it turned. Slowly it turned to face me, and I swear to God, the face was wrong. Its eyes were too big, almost bulging out of its sockets. Its mouth was wide open, unnaturally wide and black. No teeth, no tongue, just a black pit where its mouth should be. And the eyes. They weren't eyes, just hollow, dark holes that seemed to stare straight through me. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam flickered as it hit the ground, but when I looked up, the thing was gone. Just gone. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it around, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold onto it. There was nothing. No footprints, no wet marks where it had been standing. It was like I'd imagined the whole thing, except I knew I hadn't. I went back behind the counter, trying to calm down, but I couldn't stop shaking. Every noise made me jump. The wind outside howled louder, slamming rain against the windows, and for the next hour, I didn't move from that spot. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for anything to come back. Around 3:30, the power went out. Just like that, everything was plunged into darkness. No lights, no sound, just me, the wind, and the rain. I grabbed my phone, using it as a flashlight, when I heard the door chime. That bell sound still haunts me. I looked over, and there, in the dim light from my phone, I saw it again. Standing just inside the door, the same pale figure, dripping wet, staring at me with those hollow eyes. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures, all with the same hospital gowns, the same sunken eyes, the same open mouths. They just stood there, staring, watching. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't breathe. I ran into the supply room and locked the door, my heart slamming in my chest so hard I thought I'd pass out. I could hear the door chime again and again as more of them came in. Shuffling, dragging feet, the wet slap of bare flesh on tile, and then they started whispering. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through dead leaves. But it got louder, the whispers filling the room until I couldn't hear anything else. They were speaking in some language I couldn't understand, harsh and guttural, like nails scraping against bone. I don't know how long I was in that supply room. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. The whispers grew louder and louder until they were all I could hear. I covered my ears, rocking back and forth, praying for it to stop. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The footsteps, the whispers, all of it gone. I sat there for what felt like forever before I finally got the nerve to check the store. When I opened the door, the power was back on, and the store was empty. No wet footprints, no figures, no whispers. Just the sound of the rain, which had finally started to let up. I quit that job the next day. I couldn't explain what happened to my boss without sounding like a lunatic, so I just told him I wasn't cut out for night shifts anymore. I haven't set foot in that store since. But here's the thing. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling and the rain starts to fall, I swear I can still hear those whispers, like they're waiting for me to come back. If you ever find yourself working a graveyard shift, especially out in the middle of nowhere, trust me, there's something out there, something waiting, something that knows you're alone. I thought quitting would free me from whatever had taken residence in that gas station, but I was wrong. The whispers didn't just haunt my nights, they bled into my days. Every creak in my apartment, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sent my heart racing. I was jumpy and on edge, but what could I do? I tried to forget it, to convince myself it was just a bad dream. Weeks passed, and I slowly began to resume some semblance of normal life. I got a new job, day shifts at a local convenience store that was always bustling with customers. I thought maybe the constant interaction would help drown out the paranoia that had seeped into my bones. I was wrong. One night, a month after my last shift at the gas station, I was awoken from a deep sleep by a sound that made my heart drop. It was a soft, persistent tapping against my bedroom window. I bolted upright, eyes darting around my dark room. I told myself it was just the branches of a tree, but deep down I knew that was a lie. The tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent. With shaky hands, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the space around me. Nothing. The shadows danced under the faint light, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to get up. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain, expecting to see nothing more than the dark outline of the trees against the night sky. Instead, I froze. There, outside, standing beneath the faint glow of a streetlight, were those figures. The same hospital gowns, the same hollow eyes that had haunted my nightmares since that night at the gas station. They were standing in a perfect line, facing my window as if waiting for something. I couldn't breathe, my throat tightened like a vise. Suddenly, one of them raised an arm, pointing directly at me. I stumbled back, fear crashing over me like a tidal wave. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, desperately trying to call someone, anyone, but the screen went black. I cursed under my breath, shaking it, hoping it would turn back on. The tapping resumed, louder this time, echoing through the house like a death knell. I could hear the whispers again, but they were different now, more urgent. I pressed my back against the wall, the coldness of it grounding me, trying to force myself to think rationally. They were outside. They couldn't get in. I had locked every door, secured every window, but the tapping grew more aggressive, like they were trying to break in. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but where would I go? They were already here. Suddenly, my phone flickered back to life. I glanced at the screen, relieved to see it still had some battery left. I quickly dialed 911, heart pounding as the phone rang. A woman's voice finally answered. and I started to spill everything, telling her about the figures outside, the whispers, everything. But before I could finish, the line went dead. I stood there, frozen in disbelief, when I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. They were inside. I dashed to my bedroom door, throwing it open and sprinting into the hallway. I could hear them now, their whispers growing louder, mingling with the sound of their shuffling feet. Panic set in as I rushed to the front door, but it was locked. I fumbled with the lock, the whispers crescendoing behind me, a chorus of disembodied voices growing louder and louder. Finally, I flung open the door and bolted outside. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I sprinted down the street, glancing back to see them standing in my doorway, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They didn't chase me, they just stood there watching. I ran without thinking, my feet pounding against the pavement, heart racing as I tried to put as much distance as I could between them and me. It didn't stop until I reached the convenience store where I worked. I pushed through the doors, nearly tripping over my own feet, and stumbled to the counter, gasping for breath. The store was quiet as usual for that hour, but the familiar hum of the refrigerators and the flickering lights felt like a blanket of safety wrapping around me. I leaned against the counter, trying to calm my racing heart. I convinced myself that I was safe here. They wouldn't follow me inside. My co-worker Jenna looked up from where she was restocking shelves, concern etched on her face. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Figures," I panted, trying to catch my breath. "They're back. The ones from the gas station." Jenna raised an eyebrow, skepticism dripping from her voice. "What do you mean, figures? You're joking, right? This is some kind of prank?" "No," I shouted, gripping the edge of the counter. "I'm serious. They were in my house, so I saw them." Her expression softened and she stepped closer. "You need to calm down. It's just the night shift getting to you. Why don't you take a break?" I shook my head, the memory of their hollow eyes still fresh in my mind. "No, you don't understand. I've seen them before. They're real." Before she could respond, the lights flickered again, and the power went out. The silence that followed felt thick and suffocating. My pulse raced as I reached for the flashlight under the counter, fumbling to turn it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the aisles, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard the faint sound of whispers coming from the aisles. My stomach dropped as I turned toward the sound, the beam of light quivering in my grip. "Jenna," I called out, but there was no response. The whispers grew louder, echoing around me, swirling through the darkness like a sinister wind. I stepped back, heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw them. And the figures appeared at the end of each aisle, stepping into the light, their gnarled faces twisted in grotesque smiles. They weren't just standing there anymore, they were moving closer. Their eyes glinted in the flashlight's beam, and I could see their mouths stretching wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed to scrape against each other like nails on a chalkboard. I turned and ran, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I sprinted toward the back of the store, the whispers chasing me, a chorus of haunting voices urging me to stop. I reached the door leading to the stockroom, yanking it open and slamming it behind me. The stockroom was dimly lit, shelves lined with supplies, but I didn't have time to think. I rushed to the back door, desperately trying to push it open. It wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I banged against it, shouting for help. But I was alone. The whispers grew louder outside the door, a cacophony of voices blending together. I turned to look for a way out, my breath hitching in my throat when I saw one of them standing at the entrance of the stockroom, illuminated by the faint light of the street lamp outside. I could see its face clearly now, its sunken cheeks, its hollow eyes, and that terrible, gaping mouth that grinned at me as if it was savoring my fear. My stomach twisted as I backed away, desperately searching for something to defend myself with. I grabbed a metal pipe off the shelf, clenching it tight as I faced the creature. It took a step forward, and I swung the pipe wildly, missing by inches. It didn't flinch, it just kept coming, its body swaying as it moved closer. I swung again, this time hitting it square in the shoulder. The sound of metal against flesh echoed through the stockroom, but the creature didn't stop. Instead, it let out a shrill, piercing shriek that reverberated in my ears, making me wince. I turned to flee, slamming through the back door and out into the cool night air. I had no idea where to go. The street was empty, save for the flickering street light, casting long shadows. I glanced back at the store, fear clawing at my chest as I saw the figures pouring out of the entrance, their bodies gliding effortlessly toward me. I ran, adrenaline surging through my veins as I dashed down the street. I had to find help. I couldn't face them alone. I stumbled past darkened houses, praying someone would see me, would hear my screams. But the night was silent. Finally, I saw lights ahead. The diner still open at this hour. I sprinted toward it, bursting through the door. The bell jingled, but there were no customers, just the tired-looking waitress behind the counter and the cook flipping burgers in the back. "Help, please," I gasped, collapsing onto a stool. The waitress looked up, her eyes wide. "What's wrong?" "Something's chasing me?" "They're in the gas station. They're here." She frowned, clearly not believing me, but before she could respond, I heard the door chime behind me. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach as I saw them enter, gliding over the threshold, eyes locked on me. The whispers began again, louder, more insistent. They surrounded me, drowning out everything else. "Get away from her," the waitress shouted, grabbing a frying pan from the counter. But the figures didn't even flinch. I stood frozen in fear, my heart pounding in my chest as they advanced. I felt the air grow thick around me, the whispers swirling in a frenzied chant. And then it happened. A blinding light erupted in the diner, spilling over everything. I shielded my eyes, feeling warmth envelop me as the figures recoiled, hissing like angry cats. The waitress's pan clattered to the floor, and the cook rushed out, confusion etched on his face. "Get back," the waitress yelled, brandishing the frying pan like a sword. The light faded, and I found myself trembling, adrenaline coursing through me. The figures had retreated, hovering at the door, their glowing eyes still locked onto me. "Stay behind me," the waitress ordered, taking a step toward them. But before I could protest, the figures let out a collective wail that shook the very foundation of the diner. The lights flickered, and the whispers crescendoed, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to the back exit, desperate to escape. I pushed through the door and stumbled outside, heart racing, not looking back. I could hear the waitress shouting something, but it was drowned out by the whispers. I ran down the street, into the night, the figures fading into the darkness behind me. The whispers slowly faded, but I knew they wouldn't give up that easily. No matter where I went, they would always be watching.